Hey there. Today we're going behind the scenes at Disneyland during the 80s and 90s with Rand Boyd, author of the book Elbow Grease and Pixie Dust. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 62 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton, and I'm really excited to be back with you in 2019 with the first of many interview shows that are going to be coming up this year. During the past few years, I've been lucky enough to talk to some really cool people who were involved behind the scenes at Disney. Whether it's Steve Alcorn, who worked at Epcot Center, Bruce Broughton, who was involved with a lot of the great music, and even Dan Cockerell, who worked in operations and some leadership roles at Walt Disney World. But there are still some areas where I know very little. Some of the behind-the-scenes departments that aren't as obvious, and if they're doing their jobs well, you barely notice that they're there. And that's why I was really excited to read Rand Boyd's book, Elbow Grease and Pixie Dust, Memories of Disneyland Maintenance, where he tells his story of working at Disneyland for 20 years during the 80s and 90s. He started at the warehouse, eventually worked in maintenance, did a lot of deliveries during the graveyard shift, and he just has a lot of interesting stories about what it was like to work behind the scenes at Disneyland. And that book also includes the story of his partner, Eileen Schneider, who worked at Disneyland for 40 years and is still working there right now. And both of them have such interesting stories that complement each other well and gave me a lot of insight that I wasn't aware of in terms of how the parks function. And I highly recommend the book, and I'm really excited to bring you this podcast with Rand Boyd, where we talk about why he wanted to write this book and especially get more background on his story and what it was like to work at Disneyland during that time in some of the roles where we don't have as much knowledge. So it was really cool to get a chance to talk to Rand. And before we get to that conversation, I wanted to briefly mention that you can help to support the podcast by becoming an official member of the Tomorrow Society, which has some really cool perks, including a membership card and button, plus access to the monthly Tomorrow Society Bulletin podcast. I released a free preview of this month's episode last week here on the main feed if you want to check that out. So you can pledge $1 or $2 per show to really help to keep the podcast going. And to learn more, go to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. That's patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. But let's get to the main event. Here is Rand Boyd. Well, let's start with your background. Going back to before you started at Disneyland, like what made you interested or how did you get started working at Disneyland?
When I was in high school, I had a job. My first job when I was 16, I was a draftsman at a small electronics company in Anaheim. And that's what I did when I was in high school. And so when I graduated, I decided I didn't want to work in an office. I kind of had my fill of that. So anyways, and so it's like so many of my other friends that lived locally, they had summer jobs at either Knott's Berry Farm, the typical theme parks that are in this area. Well, I grew up in Buena Park, so I didn't really have an interest in working at Knott's Berry Farm because that's where I grew up with it. So in Anaheim, the Disneyland there was always kind of special. It wasn't a place we visited very often because it was, even in the 70s and the early 80s when I graduated high school, it was still kind of, for us it was expensive. So it wasn't a place I'd been to very often. And so I applied right when I graduated high school because I didn't really have anything else going anyways. And I I didn't get hired. And so, and it wasn't for a couple of months. I got the thanks but no thanks letter. And then a few months later, oh, maybe, I don't know, mid-June or thereabouts, then I got a call saying, are you still interested in the job? And I said, sure. I was working at Taco Bell at the time. So I said, yeah, sure. And drove down to casting down in off of Harbor there. And the rest is history. I was there 20 years.
Wow, well, that's interesting. Yeah, because you hear so many stories about people that say, it's my dream since I was 3 and stuff. But it sounds like it started out as a summer job, but it then ended up being so much more. So I know you started working in the warehouse. So how did that come to be, and what was it like to work in that department?
Well, before I get to that, you mentioned about the, I always wanted to work there thing. So the book is actually, most of it is about Eileen Schneider, my partner, who was the first female machinist at Disneyland and had 20 years in maintenance and all that. Well, she really was one of those type of people that I always wanted to work at Disneyland, and that's what she worked towards. And that's why one of the big reasons why she was the first female machinist at the park. So there is that aspect to
Oh,
my
yeah.
story. It's just secondhand. But as far as the warehouse, and so as I said in the book, I really, when I worked there, when I got hired there, I just wanted to work in the park. It was just a summer job. I was going to go off to college after the summer, and so I just assumed I'd be working on an attraction, but that wasn't on the table. They offered me the warehouse, a graveyard custodial, and merchandise over at the hotel. And none of those actually sounded very attractive, to be honest with you. So I figured, well, warehouse, that was about as 180 degrees away from office work that you could get. And so I said, oh, what the hell? So I took that job. That's how I ended up in the warehouse.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you mentioned that in the book where they give you those options, and I could see myself in that going like, yes, I'm going to work on Space Mountain or something, or I'm going to be out on Main Street, and you're like, really? Really? So describe that, because I know you talk about in the book, you say, well, you're working at Disneyland, but you actually barely saw the park. So what was that experience like, being there and not really actually being inside the park like people might expect?
Well, that's the thing of it, isn't it? So, I mean, I'm 18 years old, and I was really excited about getting a job at Disneyland, but we parked the warehouses in the back in the north part of the park, off of Ball Road there, and so I would drive in the Ball Road gate, park there, and then go into the warehouse and change and then do all my stuff inside this building all day long. And so it was kind of like it ended up being like office work except with forklifts and trucks. And I was inside all day, and it was in the back areas. And because you were in the warehouse, so there wasn't really any. I didn't see anything of the park except for lunch when we'd go out. So I got to tell you, it was a little disappointing. I mean, this as an 18-year-old. Later on, I appreciated the time I spent there because in all those years in maintenance, working in the rain and cold and graveyard shifts and all that, you kind of appreciate having a roof over your head. But when you're 18 and kind of full of vinegar, that's maybe not as exciting of a job as you would like.
Yeah, I can imagine it. Having worked all various jobs, myself at that time, you're like excited to get out and work, and then it's like, oh. But so you mentioned the graveyard shift, though. How did that change where you ended up moving to a different job where you were at least out and about in the park?
So when I started in the warehouse, I was on day shift, and I worked in what was called the receiving cage, the marking cage, and just did basically help there was this crew of little old women that used to put price tags on all the merchandise, and I would assist them doing that. I'd move, do all the heavy lifting, that kind of thing. Anyways, at some point, I got out of there, and I ended up, well, actually, I quit. I was at the end of the summer. I was a seasonal, and I had no intentions of going back. Went off to college and needed a job come January, and I got a call from a supervisor named Steve Hill, who worked graveyard at the warehouse, and he said, hey, do you want to come back and work in graveyard? And at first I said no, and then he explained to me what I'd be doing. I wouldn't be inside the building. I'd be out and about, and I said, oh, okay. that sounded actually kind of interesting. So I did it. And I'm glad I did because it was great. What we did is the graveyard was the delivery shift for the warehouse. And so everything, all the orders, the food, merchandise, that sort of thing that was picked during swing shift and days would then be delivered by us. We were the delivery shift. And so we would use forklifts or we use these big trams and trailers and drag these trailers out into the park, merchandise, and then food was on pallets. And I got to see all sorts of the areas. In fact, more of the park than I ever believed that I could see. The rare areas, the tunnels, everything. The warehouse goes everywhere. The island. I remember one of the things we would do is we would take the food. In those days, there was a lunch counter on the island in the fort,
Yeah.
and it served pickles, and it had a soda machine, and I want to say it served potato chips, and so we would pull these buckets of pickles, and we would load up these boxes of Laura Scudder potato chips, and and also along that way with CO2 tanks, and then the soda came in these metal tanks back in those days. Now it's in cardboard boxes, but back in those days it was these metal tanks, and we would take this all down to the dock, throw it onto one of the Tom Sawyer rafts, and drive it across down to the far dock, and then with a security guard along to unlock things for us, and then we would use hand trucks and take it up to this little lunch counter. I thought that was like the coolest thing ever because I learned how to drive the rafts. I was on the island, at the middle of the night, and it was just very cool. I mean, it was such a nice change from being stuck inside all day.
Yeah, it's still crazy to me from reading that in the book. You have this kind of glamorous view of like, well, Disneyland, it's like magic. I'm sure they have all these really amazing watercraft and different ways to present it. It's like, no, they put you on the raft going across the river. That's an amazing thought to me that would happen.
Oh yeah, and it was very matter of fact. I mean, I remember the first time we went down there, this fella and he was training me, and he says, "Okay, well, we're going to drive this raft over. We just have to wait for the security guard." And I said, "We're going to drive the raft?" And he goes, "Yeah." And he cranks it over and starts it up, and I go, "You know how to drive these?" And of course. And I said, "It's not a problem?" And he goes, "No, no, no." He says they're a little skittish because they don't have a keel. They're just flat bottoms, so they tend to slide on the water. But once you get the hang of it, they're actually pretty cool to drive. And so after a few days of him doing it, then he let me try it, and that was a lot of fun. Of course, you had to be careful. You didn't want to bang into the dock because you'd break the wood, and then on the boat or on the dock, and you could get in trouble for that. But other than that, it was kicks.
Yeah, the whole thing, just the idea of being in Disneyland in the middle of the night and doing all of that is a little, I wouldn't say creepy, but a little eerie being there, just like for a place that's so active during the day, kind of seeing that other side of it. Like, what's it like working there in the middle of the night?
It's very, believe it or not, it's very shiny. And I'll tell you why that is because the custodial department, one thing they do every night is they use fire hoses and they wash down all the areas. So everything is always very shiny. It looks like a movie because you've got all the area lighting on, and the slurry or the blacktop or the pavers now in a lot of areas is kind of glistening wet. So it's always shiny, and it also can be slippery, especially in the winter. They used to put out an all call on the radio when it got really cold because we get black ice on a couple of the bridges, the wood bridges.
Mm-hmm.
The black ice would form, and so that was dangerous when you're driving across that stuff. And the other thing that I always think about was a lot of times, for some reason, the sound department will leave a lot of the background music on in some of the areas. And so when I worked in the arcade shop, I'd go out and I'd work on the Frontierland shooting arcade, and I'd be out there working, clearing coin jams or working on the guns or whatever it was I was doing. And that background music in Frontierland would be playing. And I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but it's a lot of famous theme music, like from the theme from, I think, Wild Wild West,
Yeah.
and Clint Eastwood music, and Rawhide. And I don't know how long that loop is, but I tell you, it's not long enough because, after a few years of hearing Rawhide over and over again, oh, no, thank you.
It's probably like a half hour or something, right? Like, because no one really just, I mean, there are people that do it, but most people don't spend like an hour straight or 45 minutes just like listening to the loop. So, yeah, I can
Yeah.
imagine with Rawhide, with the whip and everything, it'd be like, oh my gosh, that doesn't
Gosh,
sound so
yeah.
great.
When I was a planner towards this is like late 90s. I was a maintenance planner for a short time, and I had the chance to bring some classmates of mine in and give them a backstage tour as part of a class I was in. And so I checked out a van, and so these folks weren't Disney people. They were from other professions, and there were about 4 or 5 of us. And I was taking them around. This was about 2 or 3 in the morning, and driving around and showing them. And then, in those days, you could go into the attractions. So I took them into some of the attractions and showed them the workshops and so on and so forth. Showed them New Orleans main kitchen, a lot of the areas. And at the end of the night, I asked them. I said, "So what was your favorite part?" And I expected for them to say, "Oh, going inside the pirate ride" or something like that. To a person, they all told me the same thing. They said the most exciting thing to them was when I drove down Main Street at 3 in the morning, and here they are in a van, and they're driving down Main Street, and all the lights are on the facades, and they thought that was the coolest thing ever that they drove down Main Street. And I thought about that, and I go, that is actually kind of cool. It is. And so I think that's something else that sticks out in my head is this idea of driving down Main Street.
Well, yeah, because I've even seen it where you see pictures of like a regular car in a place where it's not supposed to be. And I always look at it and go, that just looks wrong. That's, but if I was riding in a car like around the park, because the park is Disneyland, especially, is not that big. I mean, it seems huge, but compared to like some of the other parks, but it seems weird to have a car in some of those areas.
Well, you're right, because it throws off the scale because everything is downscaled, and so when you have something like that large that's out of place, then you realize exactly how small things are. So, like for example, one of the things that I would do is when I worked in maintenance services is we would change out the Tom Sawyer rafts. We would take one out and take it to the cycle shop or whatever, and we had these huge what we call Sears trailers. Had these giant aircraft wheels on them. They were very large, and we would take them we'd follow the crane. The crane would drive down the parade route through Small World, down through the hub. We'd open up that cross piece on the Frontierland gate is actually on a pivot. And so we would open that up to allow the crane to get through. And also we needed that open because what they do is we'd go down to the big river right there at the dock. The crane would set up, would lift one of the rafts out of the water and place it on this trailer. Then we would drive it out. Well, you don't realize how small the park is until you're trying to drive this huge raft out. And you don't realize the raft is huge until it's about 8 feet in the air and it's super wide, and you're trying to get it past the Golden Horseshoe facade without tearing the signs off the side of the wall. And then you get down through the bridge that goes through Frontierland, and it'll just barely fit through that gate. And that's why we have to swing the upright, the sign part open, because the mast on the raft is so tall that's the only way we can get it through. The other tight spot is Small World Gate. It barely fits through that thing too. So yeah, when you're starting to move large things through the park, then you realize exactly how tiny the place is.
Well, yeah, and that also raises the question about how dangerous it is, which I know you brought up in your book of talking about, not like tons of serious injuries, but close calls and little injuries and such, especially looking back to the 80s. Now, granted, I'm not talking about it like it's ancient times, but it definitely was different. Were there times when you felt like, I don't know if we should really be doing what we're doing here?
Well, the thing is so the anecdotes a lot of the anecdotes that I mentioned are of things where something went wrong, because those are actually the most interesting stories. In fact, I even mentioned that in the book, that thousands and thousands of jobs we did that went off without a hitch, but those are kind of boring on the
Right.
surface, so there's that. So really, but it wasn't. We were working in an industrial and commercial environment, so we were working with heavy equipment, and we were working with, depending upon the department I was in, high voltage. It's not a kiddie park. It's not a playground. So you have to have your brains are about you and things like that. And And even then, even the best laid plans can go wrong, and there can be an accident. But we were always very, very lucky. The amount of professionalism and maintenance has always been very high, and it was because of that we always avoided anything really serious happening. But the '80s, though, to your point, the '80s was a little bit more Wild Westy, I guess. I mean, you got the job done, so things were maybe a little looser than they could have been because it was all about getting the job done. And you used your experience and you used your and your knowledge to do it as safely as possible. But still, though, the priority number one was completing the work. So maybe, yeah, we took some chances that maybe we wouldn't normally now. In fact, certainly not me now as I'm older. So
Yeah, well, the thing is too, like you mentioned, it's easy to look at something like Pirates of the Caribbean, for example, and I look at it and I go, "Oh, these are just these fun animatronics." But those are like heavy machines, right? Those are, I mean, I hate to say dangerous, but things like that go in the park. Like you said, you could almost say it's not just a playground because a lot of the cool things are also like industrial machines so that they can operate over and over and over and over and over again and work. That's a good point though. And I wasn't going to imply too that people weren't good. It actually means, like you said, people were so good at their jobs to be able to work things out. And like you mentioned in the book, the people being so specialized in kind of this, like, I hate to say old school, but this, like, these union workers or that are really specialized and really good at fixing things. I'm sure that was a big part of why things operated so well, was having people that had been there for such a long time, right?
and it's not just longevity, but that these people were very experienced in their crafts. Most of them came from other, not professions, but working outside, from the halls, the union halls, you working construction or something like that. I was one of the few in the '80s. It was very seldom you'd see people come up, from another. Like for example, I went from the warehouse, and then I went to DeVry and got a degree in electronics, and then I got a job in the arcade shop working on arcade games, that kind of thing. So that was very seldom. Usually what it was is somebody would hire in already with 10, 15, in some cases 20, 30 years of experience in their trade working somewhere else. And they would bring all that into the park with them. That was very common back then. I have a feeling it's not quite as common now, but I don't know. I can't really speak for that. But and so you had this tremendous amount of experience that was coming in from the crafts. And the way the division was organized, it was organized by department. So you had all the plumbers in one department, electricians in one department, that sort of thing. So then you had this great mentoring system where the most senior people could take the new people, and whether that meant new in the trade or new just to the park, and could train them and get them oriented to the shop culture. That's something I'll tell you right now that is lacking, I think, in the division nowadays. In the mid-'90s, they went to a new organization where they broke up the departments and put them in these maintenance teams based on geography, and went across the craft line. So you'd have let's say the North team was a collection of machinists and electricians and sound people and that kind of thing like that. And what that did is it took the best, these people that would have been mentors to younger craftspeople, and took them out of that loop, because now that person was way over on the east side or whatever, and didn't have the ability to help out the people on the north side or whatever. And so that's caused a lot of problems, and from what I understand, still does. Honestly, I have no idea why they went to that, why they broke up the department organization. It was working fine. You know how executives are.
Yeah, well, I've worked for some big companies, and especially when something gets to a certain size, I think you have it where, one, there's a bigger split between the top and the bottom, and people make these decisions, and it's not done with the thought of how will this function in reality. And I don't want to get too far off track with talking about organizational culture, but I understand what you're saying, because basically if you spread out your experts and they're not able to train the right people and bring up the next experts, and then you have everyone just kind of in their own silos, if you will, it might sound great on a piece of paper or something, but it might not work in the park. Because I think of how complicated Disneyland is. And part of the reason for its success and making it becoming so big where there might be those issues is because things work so well. I mean, gone to enough other parks and such. I mean, especially as a kid I went to Disney World a lot, but went to Disneyland. Things really work. And for something that complicated, I think, like you said, it's owed a lot to how the structure was then and maybe not what it is now. I mean, I haven't worked there, but I'm just thinking it from what I know, the basics of it. It's a giant company now. It's so much bigger than it ever was.
Yeah, exactly. And there was no need to move away from a system that worked just fine. And it had nothing to do with scaling or anything like that. It did work very well. So I'm hoping at some point they'll go back to it because it's the best way to do the job.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, because, leaderships change and some things are probably done better now and other things were not. But things could flip around that way.
That wasn't the point of the book. The point of the book was it was two things. One was to tell the story of Eileen as the first female machinist and all the amazing things that she did over her 20 years in maintenance. And then the other thing was why I told my story was I thought that was a good bookend because she was at a much higher level than I was. And I thought between her experiences and my experiences, I actually told a good story about the maintenance division as a whole over the 80s and the 90s. And so that's why I have the first chapter just talks about the organization of the division and the types of work it did and how it went about that work. And it's supposed to be a celebration of the division of the people. Because, I mean, who knows if somebody's going to write another book on maintenance. I hope they do, to be honest with you, because I, certainly didn't cover it all. And but if nobody ever does, at least there's something out there that talks about all the amazing things that we did in the 80s and the early 90s.
Yeah, and I think your book does a great job in spotlighting just all the successes that a department that definitely, I'm sure from me and from others, did not get as much credit as it should. Because if things work well, all that work that you and others are doing behind the scenes, we don't see it. Because that means everything's working great. So, and I love all the little anecdotes that come from that. And I definitely want to talk about Eileen's story. Before I do that, though, I want to ask you one more question about your story here, which is you have a story about seeing Walt's ghost, perhaps, which I thought was a really good story, and I'd love for you to talk about it.
Yeah, I wasn't going to put that in the book, but the publisher asked me if I had any anecdotes dealing with Walt Disney, and I don't know why he would think that. I'm not that old, but I thought about it, and so I put the two. The one that the construction laborer told me about his interaction with Walt Disney back when they were building Tomorrowland, and then that brought up, that reminded me of my little story when I first started, and I never told anybody. I kept it to myself for so many years because it's just kind of a goofy thing. If you say, oh, yeah, I saw Walt Disney's ghost, you kind of go, oh, yeah, right. And so I always kind of kept it to myself. And then, maybe in the late 80s or early 90s, I heard a story of an electrician, and she had claimed to have seen Walt's ghost. And she got razzed, something fierce. And so when I saw what happened to her, then I definitely didn't tell anybody. But I figured, well, for the sake of the book, then I thought Walt Disney should be mentioned. But yeah, real quickly, the story is when I first started, maybe it was 84 and the summer of 84, and I was working on Graveyard in the warehouse. Must have been early because I was working by myself, and it was one of the first times I'd worked by myself, and I was pulling some wagons down Main Street towards the town square. Went down, and I turned left to go through the A house gate there. And as I was driving very slow, very, very slow, a couple of miles an hour. And as you're driving through, if you know the geography of the park, as you're driving towards A house break area gates there, the Main Street hat shop is right there to your right. And so I was looking through the glass of the shop, and you can see into the shop, and then you can see through into the Lincoln, where they exit Lincoln. Anyways, and I saw this older gentleman standing in the shop, right up next to the glass, staring out of the glass across the street. He was just staring across where at the firehouse. And I go, well, that's odd. And I remember thinking it was odd because I was new. And I remember, so I was very hypersensitive to how people looked. And I noticed that he had a mustache. And I thought, well, that's odd because I thought nobody was allowed to have facial hair. Now, later on, I had found out that there were some men who had hired in before. They were grandfathered in and they were allowed to keep their mustaches. I only met one like that. But still, though, at that time when I saw this gentleman, he was an older gentleman and he was wearing a gray suit. And that was the other thing I thought was odd because we all wore costumes. We all wore blues or whatever, or whites. And so I thought, well, maybe he's a supervisor. And I was getting closer and I thought, I don't know, he might be a supervisor, but he wasn't moving. He was just kind of staring at the glass. And then all of a sudden it occurred to me, I go, wow, he really looks familiar. Who, and as I got closer and closer, all of a sudden it occurred to me, the reason he looked familiar was I recognized who it was. I go, oh, no, that can't be. It's just got to be a coincidence. It's got to be some supervisor that looks like him. So as I got up right next to the building, you pass this corner of the building and you can't see in. And then there's a side window. So I thought, well, I'll be really close then and I can get a good look at him, second look to see if, who this guy is. Well, of course, as I passed the corner and looked through the side window, there's nobody there. And I go, oh, son of a gun. So I got off the tram and I went into the shop and I looked around and there was nobody because I thought maybe, he'd walked over into the other area. There was nobody in there. And so I scratched on my head and I thought, you know what? I saw Walt Disney, but hell, am I going to tell anybody? Oh, no. So I got to tell you, it's still a little bit of an embarrassing story to tell just because, Walt Disney.
Well, yeah, of course, because the first thought a lot of people are going to have is, oh, of course. Yeah, you really, but part of me, regardless of it, I love the story because part of me thinks about it like, I want the idea of Walt Disney, like being in Disneyland and kind of watching over things. I like that idea. Either way, it's a neat story for that reason. And isn't the craziest thing I've heard.
Yeah. And once I found out that an electrician had also seen him, then I felt better about it. I was like, okay, then I'm not total nuts. So, but I still didn't tell anybody the story.
Well, I'm glad the editor that kind of encouraged you to do that because I think it's a great story. And I wanted, of course, like you mentioned earlier, your partner Eileen, because like you said, half the book is really, the first half is really her story, and I think her story is so interesting, being like you said, because there were so few women working like she talks about, even working in any type of area like that. And so what was it like to kind of put together her story, and how did you go about doing that for the book?
Well, it was interesting because that's what started the whole idea of the book, is I wanted to tell her story, but I knew that she still works there and she doesn't work in maintenance, but she still works there, and so that meant that she wasn't going to be able to write it herself, and she had no interest in writing it herself. In fact, she kind of poo-pooed the whole idea because she didn't really think that anybody really cared, nor did she even think that what she did was that significant in any fashion. And of course, I think that's total balderdash. She did amazing things, but she did them simply because she wanted to do them, not because she was trying to make a statement or anything, which I think is even better. So I contacted the theme park press and I said, hey, I got this idea. I want to write this book about my partner, and then as a bookend, I've got my story, and I said between the two stories, I think would tell an interesting story about maintenance. And the publisher says, yeah, he says nobody's ever written a book about that, and so they'd be interested. And at first, I was just going to write her story in third person. Eileen did this, Eileen did that, but I wanted her to have her voice. And so what I did is I wrote it in first person as her, and we've been together for a long time. So I felt comfortable doing that. I also took about 4 or 5 hours of oral histories from her. I asked her, I'd heard a bunch of stories from her, but I asked her specific questions and things like that to get that down. And then I built this narrative in her voice of her time, how she got hired into the park, and how she was when she was a girl, and then going in through the different jobs that she had at the park. And I think I succeeded in getting her getting a voice. I know friends of hers have read it, and they all say that it sounds like her talking. So I'm very proud of that. But yeah, but definitely that's why she starts out. She started in 1978. She was one of four women that were brought in through affirmative action to redress an imbalance, gender imbalance that was identified by the federal government. There was actually no women working in the maintenance division except unless you were an administrative assistant. There was no craftspeople that were female. So she was one of the first. She was the first female. She was the first female machinist. And then I think, if I remember, there was a mechanic and an electrician. Forget what the other person did. Different craft. Anyways, she's out of that initial four people. She's the only one that's left. Everybody else never made it this far. And she's still there. She just celebrated last year. She celebrated 40 years in the park. So she's still going strong.
40 years is quite an achievement working there, especially given, the different roles that she's had. So I know that she mentions a bit in the book just what it's like to kind of work in this male-dominated field. I mean, when you talk with her, how does she look upon kind of the challenges of that? Like, I know she talks a lot about people that mentored her, but just the other side of it, just the difficulties there.
Yeah, there's two things going on, I think. One, I think what helped. Okay, so she was harassed, and I think a lot heavier than is mentioned in the book, because I didn't really want to really look at that too deeply. But I think what helped, two things helped her. One, she was very young. She was only 17, 18 years old when she started working there, so she was very naive. So I think a lot of the harassment just simply went over her head. She just didn't realize that she was being harassed because she didn't really know what was going on, which was just fine. And then two, it didn't last very long because they quickly identified that she was serious, and she was serious about her craft, and she was serious about the job and about getting better and learning. I don't care how reactionary old fart you are. You're in your craft because you love being a machinist in this case, or anything. So you're going to respond to that. When you see somebody that loves your craft as much as you do, even if you are, an old chauvinist, you're gonna respond to that. And I think, and that's exactly what happened. It took them a while, but eventually they came around, and they ended up being a big supporter of her. And of course she learned. Also, she's one of those kind of people that has this perpetual. She could be a poster girl for Disney. She's got that Disney thing. I don't know. I can't describe it any other way than that. She's, after 40 years, she still loves her job, and she still goes in with the same level of energy that she did 40 years ago, and people respond to that. So I think that that's another one of her little secrets. And then she's just a damn good worker. I mean, she breaks your back for you, and she's smart as a whip, and that's why she was so successful. And also, it was tough. I mean, there's no way around it. 1978. Things weren't good for women generally in male-dominated professions. So it really says something for her that she was as successful as she was.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the fact that she was so good at her job, the fact that she's been there for 40 years and moved through different roles, and that's just a testament, like you said, to how hard she works. And I know the two of you actually met while you both worked at Disneyland. So how did that happen?
Yeah, and that was part of this whole idea how I sold it to the publisher, was that for about 17 years we worked in the same division, and that back in those days the division was small. It was possible to know pretty much everybody, but I always worked nights and she always worked days, that kind of a thing. And so I knew of her, but I never knew her, and of course she never knew me at all, because I was just a little front. But so about 17 years we didn't know each other, and then she got a job as a temporary supervisor in a maintenance team, restaurant retail, and I was a foreman in the arcade shop at the time. And I walked into the team offices to pick up a radio, and she was in there. And her desk happened to be next to where the radio racks were. And walked up there. She was talking to our carpenter. I looked at her and I said hi, and she looked at me and kind of gave me a double look and said hi and smiled at me, and it was kind of love at first sight. Actually, it sounds kind of mushy, but it was.
Hey, it's a great story, and the fact that you guys you've been together for that long is a testament to the whole thing. So, no, I really enjoyed the book. So I'm curious too
Oh
about
yeah.
the book. Have you heard from any former coworkers or anything about the book, like about what they enjoyed or any stories you told in it?
Yeah, a few, and so far, knock on wood, all the comments have been positive. Probably the best, the one that I personally was very worried about, and also very relieved, was from Bob Penfield. Bob Penfield, I don't know if you know who he is. He actually just published his own book, his memoir. He was the last of the Club 55ers. Trying to think of the publisher where his book's from, but I can't even think of the title. But if you look at Robert Penfield, Penfield on Amazon. You get his book, but he was in maintenance. He actually was all over. He opened the park in '55, and he worked the World's Fair. He was in attractions, and he was in custodial, and then he was in. But he finished up in maintenance, and so he was in maintenance in the '80s and the '90s when I was there, and I knew him, and so I was really worried because, well, I was a little worried, but he had some very nice things to say. He made some comments on my Amazon page, and he told me personally, he said he thought that I was right on the dot and that it was an excellent book, and that I was accurate. And it was like, wow, really? And so that helped, because he carries a lot of weight. Yeah, the few people that I've talked to from that are still working there, nobody's said anything bad anyways, at least not to my face. So,
Well, I wouldn't think they would. I wasn't fishing for that, but yeah, I did look up. I'm not familiar with Bob actually. This is the first I've heard of his book, but his book's called The Last Original Disneylander. That's something I'm gonna definitely look into because I've read a lot of books about Disneyland and history, but hadn't read this one. Looks like it came out a couple years ago, so that's a really cool tip too.
yeah, you should read it. It's a good because he talks a little bit about maintenance, not as much as I expected, given how long he was there. He mainly talks about his time in at the World's Fair and the time when he was in management in operations and stuff like that. But still, though, it's worth it, especially because he was the last of the Club 55ers, and he's still going strong.
Well, that's great. That's a great tip, and I'm sure some of my listeners will probably want to check that out. And I'll find a link and I'll add it to the show notes. I also wanted to mention too that I know you work at Chapman University now, which I believe I read a story about a Disney Dream Room that they opened there in 2013, and Jack Lindquist was involved. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. So Jack Lindquist was the first president of Disneyland. He was active. He was on the board of trustees at Chapman University. And so as he was getting older, he decided that he wanted to make some donations to the campus. And so that's how I met him. I'm a special collections librarian there. And so it was decided that he wanted to make some donations to the library. So the dean dealt with him. And then, of course, I came into it as special collections because the materials that he was donating were memorabilia from his time at the park and the corporation and things like that. So then what we did is he and his wife donated a very nice sum of money. What that did is it paid for the naming of two study rooms for the students. And then we decorated the two rooms with some of his artwork. And then we had two display cases built that hold his memorabilia. So people, you don't have to be a Chapman student to come and look at this stuff. But it's really interesting memorabilia. We have his Disney Legends Award, which is very rare. We have his window. You know, when you get a window, when they used to give those out on Main Street, you'd get a replica of the window. And so we have his window. And let's see what else. Oh, just lots of things that, he was really something. He was, originally he was in marketing and he knew Walt Disney and all that. And he was the one responsible for the creation of the Disney dollars. So we have the first Disney dollars. And he was also the one who started. If you remember the gift giver event that we had, I think it was for the 30th anniversary. Where they give a car away every
Yeah.
day.
Yeah, I was
That is,
actually there that year as a kid. I remember. I did not win a car though.
so he was responsible for that. So if you recall, when you went through the turnstiles, if your number came up, then you were given this chance to pull this lever, and then you either get the car or you wouldn't, whatever. So we had that lever, and and he also, he's the one that came up with the idea of grad nights. So we have some memorabilia related to grad nights in the display cases and that kind of thing. And then the old days when you would retire, the craft people would build things for you. They'd build models. Usually, like let's say if you were an electrician, you spent most of your time working on the monorails or whatever, then they would build you a model of the monorail, that sort of thing. So it was, they don't do that anymore, but in the old days they did. And so for Jack, what they did is they built this really beautiful diorama of him running along with all these different characters, Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Goofy and that kind of thing. Just, it's one of a kind. It's a beautiful piece. So we have that. We have some other things that are very cool. And and then of course Jack wrote a book himself. It's called Service with the Mouse. And that's a good read because he talks about his time, when he worked with Walt Disney and all that. But that's all can be seen just by the public. They can go in, if you visit the Chapman campus in Orange, you can just go in and into the library, the Leatherby Libraries, and it's up on the second floor there. Actually, third floor.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, I wish I'm not going to be able to make a trip over there from Missouri anytime soon, but I think it's a lot of those pieces sound like something that would be really fun to see. And yeah, Jack's book is on my reading list for this coming year. I feel like I just revealing my lack of reading of all these key books, but I'm going to definitely try and get to it this year because that's one I want to find out a lot about.
Oh yeah, and what's nice about all these books is they're all relatively short, so they're not these massive tomes that are going to take forever to work your way through. But they're worth it. They're both Penfield's and Jack's are both worth it.
Excellent. Well, I just want to ask one more thing for you, just kind of in general. Do you still go much to Disneyland, or do you visit other Disney parks, or kind of what's your relationship like with the parks now?
I really like Walt Disney World. We used to go every year. We haven't been for the last few years, but we're going to start going again. In fact, both of us like Walt Disney World, mainly because we can go as just guests. When I go to the park, even now, I left in 2003, so it was a while ago, and I have a whole new profession, but it's too often that, Eileen and I, if we're walking to the park, we start reminiscing. Oh, I remember that, I remember this, and a little bit too much luggage. It's difficult to step back and just enjoy the park as a park. And then to be honest with you, it's not the same park that I grew up with. It's too crowded now for my taste, and it's I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting old now. I don't know, but curmudgeonly, but it's not the park that I remember. And so if I'm gonna go, I'm gonna go to Walt Disney World.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as far as I wouldn't think it'd be curmudgeonly because obviously things have changed a lot. Well, DCA was only a few years old when you left, and then Disneyland. Seriously, I don't go all the time, but from what I hear, the crowds have really grown in the past, even 5 years. I wouldn't be too hard on yourself for that. And that's the one benefit. I love Disneyland, but the one benefit of Disney World is the space, for sure, even with the huge crowds. But I'm glad you can enjoy those parks, and I totally understand about having worked there for so long.
Yeah, but I have good memories of the park. I grew up there, so I really literally did grow up there. So it means quite a bit to me. Part of it too means that I'd rather remember it how it looked in 1983 than how it looks now. So
yeah, for sure. So this has been great, Rand. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and the book is excellent. So if a listener is interested in the book and wants to learn more, where should they go?
Oh, well, you can go to Theme Park Press, that website, but that will just link back to Amazon. So probably Amazon is probably the best go. And then it's elbow grease and pixie dust, memories of Disneyland maintenance, or you can just elbow grease. There's not going to be much if you just Google elbow grease and pixie dust. So, but that's probably the best way. You can buy it as a Kindle or as the paperback. So, but buy it. Buy 2 copies.
Well, I'll definitely have the links to directly to that Amazon page in the show notes, so it's really easy to find out about the book, and I definitely recommend it, especially if you're looking for stories kind of from what's going on behind the scenes. And thanks so much for being on the podcast, Rand. This was great.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you reading the book, and I appreciate you inviting me on your show.
Well, that was great. I love hearing all those stories about what it was like to work behind the scenes at Disney's original park. If you'd like to know what's going on behind the scenes with me, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc, or Facebook, Instagram, or Pinterest at Tomorrow Society. If you'd like to contact me, you can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. And don't forget that you can become an official member through Patreon at patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. In 2 weeks, I will be speaking with Skipper Ben Rebstock, who you know from Inside the Magic, the Marty Called podcast, Attractions Magazine, and a lot more. And of course, he also has some great stories about working at Walt Disney World, so you will want to check that out. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you again really soon.